Hey guys, real quick, some housekeeping items. Number one, if you would prefer to listen to the show, you can do so on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Obviously, the video version is the preferred method of watching the show simply because you get visuals and maps, which are kind of the big thing. With visuals, with that being said, everybody who apparently watches the show has an opinion on the artwork that I use. Some of you absolutely hate it. Others love it. This is sort of the only thing I'll say is I need images, and I am on a budget over here, and I cannot pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a handful of images to Getty or whomever. So if you guys have a solution, by all means, drop it in the comment section. I obviously would love to have as realistic as possible artwork for the show. So anyways, with that said, let's dive into the episode. U.S. Army Special Forces was stood up in 1952 out of the ashes of the Office of Strategic Services, more commonly referred to as the OSS. Almost immediately, ODAs or A-teams began to conduct operations in the jungles of Bolivia and Congo, to clandestine operations within MACV-SOG in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, and eventually in the mountains of Afghanistan, where ODAs linked up with the Northern Alliance to rain down hell on the Taliban in the immediate wake of 9/11. Yet, despite their legendary exploits, there appears to be a serious problem. Colonel Edward C. Crute, a 25-year Special Forces veteran, conducted a lengthy study published in 2020 with 1,200 Green Beret participants. In his 60-page plus report, he uncovered something unnerving, that there is a catastrophic identity crisis within Special Forces. He concludes, quote, "The Green Berets have a proud history, rich heritage, and a historic ethic of service to the nation and willingness to sacrifice. However, there is one very hard truth for senior Special Forces leadership from this research. The Green Berets have an identity crisis." Now, this study is illuminating and authoritative, but he makes a few categorical errors. Chiefly, he asked the participants in Special Forces which mission archetype do they self-identify with, albeit it being direct action, legacy, or modern. The legacy category presumably is the unconventional warfare or historic Green Beret archetype and or mission, if you will. Ironically, Crute and others like him fail to realize that in 72 years, not a single Green Beret has ever executed a true UW mission, and rather, their sole purpose or their legacy, literally since the 1950s, has been counterinsurgency operations, otherwise known as COIN. And predominantly, they've worked with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of host nation partners over the course of their existence. Within their long history of COIN operations, there are subcategories like direct action missions, personnel recovery operations, intelligence gathering, long-range reconnaissance, civic duties, enemy snatch and grabs, espionage, sabotage, wiretaps, training a local indigenous force, etc., etc. They've executed COIN operations and all these subcategories on nearly every continent for nearly their entire existence. And frankly, they've been among the absolute best at it. Today, we are going to go through 72 years of Special Forces history in excruciating detail. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. Okay, real quick, for those of you who are new to the channel, this is actually part 2 of a series, so it behooves you to go back and watch the first part. But just in case you're too lazy, I'll briefly try to summarize everything so you're all caught up. Sidebar within a sidebar, if you are confused by the terms counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare, as apparently many of you are, and by the way, if you are a Green Beret and you don't know the difference between UW, COIN, asymmetrical warfare, irregular warfare, shame on you. Counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare are the opposite sides of the same coin. During any revolution, there is the insurgency, and then there is the counterinsurgency that is acting against the revolt. A UW operation is when a third party, typically a state actor, injects themselves into the situation and supports the revolutionary force in an effort to overthrow or destabilize the occupying party in power. In his book, Inside the Green Berets, Arthur Charles Simpson, a Green Beret veteran himself, discusses this confusion among the public and dumbs down the SF mission set this way. He says, quote, This lack of knowledge probably results from the fact that the basic missions of special forces, while easily stated, are difficult to grasp and very difficult to carry out successfully. Briefly, the missions are these: to seek out, train, and support men capable of becoming effective guerrillas, which is UW; to seek out, engage, and neutralize guerrillas, which is counterinsurgency. These roles are not contradictory. Whether special forces develops troops or challenges and ultimately eliminates them depends on whose guerrillas they are. Simpson wrote his world-famous book in the early 80s, and because I have the luxury of historical hindsight, I can look back at 70 plus years of history and determine that Special Forces has never and will likely never conduct a UW operation. Conclusively, Green Berets are strictly a counterinsurgency force. Furthermore, before the 1980s, Special Forces almost exclusively operated as the CIA's paramilitary arm, executing what we would refer to today as special missions. These are sensitive or were sensitive and often clandestine missions that are usually under the auspices and direction of the CIA. After Vietnam, historic ties between the regiment and special forces and the CIA began to just disintegrate. And JSOC, which was a new form or category of special operations, was stood up in the 70s and in the 80s and filled that gap. Rather than using Green Berets for special missions, the CIA and the DoD tapped JSOC and more specifically Delta Force. Now we're going to pause and roll this back. We're going to start from the beginning. So you see, after World War II, many in the US and Europe assumed that there would naturally be a World War III, considering there was the Great War, or World War I, followed immediately or almost immediately by World War II not long after, and the Soviets were the next global threat. And the Allies assumed, based on the last 40 years, that the Soviets would undoubtedly invade Western and Eastern Europe, as well as other regions throughout the globe, just like Nazi Germany, Italy, and Imperial Japan. During World War II, the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA, conducted unconventional warfare operations across Europe and Asia to disrupt enemy forces and or prepare for an eventual large-scale invasion. In the aftermath of the war, the United States wanted to move forward and organize a special operations force that was ready to execute the same mission when the Soviets inevitably made their move. But that day, it just never came. And instead, the Soviets began to facilitate communist revolutions and guerrilla movements in unstable countries in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The US immediately evaluated their available resources and, of course, tapped Special Forces Green Berets to facilitate counterinsurgency operations to thwart Soviet revolutionary efforts, which makes perfect sense. By the mid-1950s, Special Forces soldiers had been training relentlessly in both the US and in Europe, conducting war games against conventional US forces, and had become the premier UW force, and therefore understood how best to fight an insurgency or squash one. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Green Berets and A-teams were being deployed all over the world. Their primary function was to meet up with military leaders, diplomats, and other partners in a variety of countries and to begin to recruit, train, and advise paramilitary or counterinsurgency guerrilla forces in order to combat communist insurgency movements. Although these were COIN missions, they also fit under the umbrella of Foreign Internal Defense, or FID. Simply put, FID is an umbrella term, while COIN is more specific. Take a look at this diagram. This is sort of all the different missions that sort of come together under FID and under COIN. And no, this is not an all-encompassing image or graph or whatever. I want to pause for a second and note that these FID missions in the mid-20th century were radically different than FID missions being done by special forces today. For example, in 2023, 10th Group deployed an ODA to Spain to conduct a JSET, otherwise known as a Joint Combat Exchange Training, with Spanish Special Forces. The Army Times describes it this way, quote, U.S. Special Forces conduct JSETs with foreign militaries and partner agencies in their home countries. JSETs facilitate shared understanding and awareness of capabilities and readiness, said Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Bowman, U.S. Special Operations Command, Europe's Special Operations Liaison Officer to Spain. More importantly, they allow for both countries' units to build bonds and relationships. which are invaluable, particularly in times of crisis. Now, not to belittle the efforts of 10th Group, but this is a lot of buzzwords and jargon that could easily be stated as we cosplayed special operations for 2 months and cannot decisively tell you what we actually accomplished. But if there is a world war that encompasses all of Europe, we have strong ties and relationships with the Spanish SF unit. Moreover, I would argue that JSETs are not FID missions. Training with professional special operations forces without an ongoing real-world mission is just training. Conventional forces can do that. For the 1950s and 1980s, FID was seen almost exclusively as a coin operation, and the only exception to this fact were the special missions. But even these special assignments were in the vein of a larger coin operation typically. But with the rise of JSOC and Delta and the collapse of the Soviet Union, fewer and fewer of these operations took shape because revolutionary movements throughout the world petered out by the end of the 1980s. Instead, special forces continued to push FID, but it had radically shifted. Instead of standing up large bands of irregulars to conduct counterinsurgency operations against communist guerrillas, special forces would deploy to host nations who already had existing special operations or ranger units, either trained by former ODAs or special forces personnel or stood up independently. Now, instead of training rangers, SF, or light infantry units, special forces conducts conventional JSETs, which was not the original intention of U.S. Army Special Forces. This is the frustrating sleight of hand the leadership in the Special Forces Regiment makes. They'll suggest that Special Forces Green Berets have always done FID missions, and therefore by continuing this tradition through JSETs, the unit is doing what it was historically intended to do. But in reality, JSETs in the 1990s and the 2000s are radically different than the counterinsurgency operations in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s. Simpson describes it this way, quote, both in numbers and variety, Special Forces missions in Latin America have been notable. Between early 1963 and 1970, the peak period, nearly 500 SF training and assistance teams were dispatched to 19 countries. The number of Latin Americans who received Special Forces training was well in the six figures. In 1965 alone, 285 busy SF troopers managed to instruct more than 41,000 military men in Latin America. There's good reasons for the special responsiveness of the South. Virtually all contain the seeds of insurgency or revolution. Small, extremely wealthy upper classes and ostentatious styles of life and lack of social consciousness juxtaposed against the grinding poverty of the rest of the population, high rates of unemployment, corruption in the government, inequitable land ownership, rural areas so backwards they have changed little in 5 centuries, birth rates which consistently outstrip economic growth, and above all, growing demands for progress, the familiar pattern of revolution. The world was a different place in the mid-20th century. Many countries the Soviets sought to undermine were what we would refer to today as developing or third world countries. Their governments were fractured or volatile, and it didn't help that many were having trouble dealing with communist guerrillas and undergrounds. Unlike today, many of these countries over the course of multiple generations and decades have progressed into more or less a modern era or modern society and now have stabilized, and they have stable governments and can manage modern economies and thus have professional military forces and therefore do not require the same demand from US partners that they once had in previous generations. If Green Berets weren't tasked to conduct counterinsurgency missions, they were deployed to execute other operations that we would, again, refer to today as special missions. So, for example, a Special Forces officer named Colonel Fontaine was Belgian by birth and had parachuted behind enemy lines in World War II to assist the French resistance against Nazi occupation, like many, if not most, of the Green Berets throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Fontaine recruited 2 other Green Berets for his team for an operation in the Congo. Resistance guerrilla fighters had seized power at least on a local level, and had in their possession some 239 American and European hostages. Fontaine and his team were tasked to rescue these hostages. The 3-man team disembarked into the Congo armed with a radio, grenades, and submachine guns. He eventually met up with some of the refugees and attempted to load them on a nearby plane, but the rebels quickly just surrounded them. Seeing as how things were turning sideways very fast, Fontaine identified an individual who he believed to be the rebel leader, so to speak. He snatched him by the arm and pulled him in close, whipped out the grenade and pulled the pin, still while holding onto the spool to ensure that the grenade didn't go off, and told the rebel leader that if his men shot him, he too would die. Emotions were obviously beginning to rise, and Fontaine was running out of options. Luckily, a Czech national, now American Special Forces soldier named Mazak, and yes, there is probably some relation to me, which is awesome, began firing his submachine gun sporadically, jumping from behind cover. And the rebels, they were just totally caught off guard, believing they were being ambushed by a much larger element, and began to disperse and run away. Fontaine threw his grenade at the fleeing enemy, which only motivated them to take off at a sprint. Fontaine and his team saved all the American and European hostages. It wasn't exactly sexy or it wasn't a well thought out plan, but it was effective. Another good example of a Special Forces clandestine counterinsurgency operation was in Bolivia in 1967, where Major Ralph Palpy Shelton and his team trained Bolivian Rangers in counterinsurgency and counter-guerrilla operations in the Andes. Just 11 days after their 6-month training course had been completed, the Bolivian Rangers zeroed in and captured Che Guevara and killed him. Special missions were also conducted in the 50s and in the 60s, all throughout Asia, including Laos, Taiwan, Vietnam, and Korea, not so dissimilar from the Special Forces operations in South America. A-teams were inserted clandestinely in coordination very often with the CIA and trained their counterparts in special operations tactics to combat various insurgent groups in real time. Now, as we jump into the Vietnam era, I want to stress this is the defining or golden age of Special Forces within the context of their 72-year history. And moreover, the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, or the CIDG mission or program, had the largest cultural impact on the regiment, more so than any other SF mission to date. Much like other Special Forces FID coin missions throughout the world, ODAs began to train Vietnamese paramilitary fighters to combat the Viet Cong as early as the late 1950s. Sam Amato led his team of 77th Special Forces group guys and trained the first group of fighters that would eventually become the Vietnamese Ranger Battalions. Soon after, the U.S. dedicated more resources and Special Forces troopers to the mission in Vietnam, and eventually they started the CIDG program. Simpson summarizes the mission this way, quote, "In the conduct of that unique program over a period of 9 years, Special Forces became involved in every conceivable aspect of counterinsurgency, military, economic, psychological, and political. The saga of the CIDG program involved thousands of U.S. Army Special Forces soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians, millions of dollars, and approximately 100 camps spread from the demilitarized zone to the Gulf of Siam. It is the story of countless small skirmishes and some big bloody battles, of carving isolated camps out of the jungle or trying to prop them up out of the Delta floods. It is a story of teaching Vietnamese how to shoot or build or farm or care for the sick or run agent operations, and of dealing with the religious and ethnic minorities of Vietnam, the Mountain Yards, the Cambodians, the Hay Hay, and the Kay Dai. It is a story of cooperation and conflict with the CIA, South Vietnamese Special Forces, MACV, AIDS, SOG, Vietnamese officials, and American Combat Unit commanders. The CIDG mission was a CIA operation which coordinated with SF and used them effectively as their paramilitary arm to execute the mission. It is worth noting that, historically speaking, as part of the Vietnam narrative, the CIDG program gets fitted in with the whole war effort. But in reality, and in the beginning, the A-teams running this program had no idea that there would be a full-blown war, and were thus conducting a covert CIA-led counterinsurgency operation in the highlands of central Vietnam. Simpson notes, quote, "The concept was formed in late 1961, and in January of 1962, representatives from the government of Vietnam, Red A tribes, and the U.S. Combined Studies Group met and agreed to certain principles. The Rede would denounce the VC and support the government of Vietnam, and the government of Vietnam agreed that the Vietnamese civilian and military officials would keep hands off. The CIA agreed to run the program, to fund it, and to coordinate with the Vietnamese. Simpson reports that the program would have died if it was not supported in every way, shape, and form by the CIA. Conceptually, the concept for the CIDG program was to insert ODAs or A teams and have them live among highland tribes. These tribes are not so dissimilar from Native American tribes in North America in the 18th and 19th century. They were all ethnically similar and shared cultural practices, but were unique from one another in a variety of ways. One thing they all shared, though, was both the North and South Vietnamese people in the lowlands despised them and referred to them as savages. Likewise, most of the village Highlanders hated both the North and South Vietnamese people. John Plaster, in his book SOG, notes, quote, "The Yards couldn't have cared less about South Vietnam as a country and felt no allegiance to some abstract paymaster like the United States. But they were loyal and ready to die for their recon teammates, American or Yard alike. The plan was to build a relationship with them, protect them, and utilize their locally trained Mountain Yard militias to conduct counterinsurgency operations against the Viet Cong. Simultaneously, the VC were attempting to infiltrate and leverage rural villages to support their insurgency operations in South Vietnam." Simpson summarizes it this way, quote, "They, meaning the CIA, were looking at a problem in counterinsurgency. The highland forests and jungles in Vietnam could provide base areas and infiltration routes for the VC and North Vietnamese, was willing or unwilling providing scouts, porters, food growers, and even recruits for the armed units. If the population could be protected, or better yet, protect itself from exploitation, the VC would be denied much needed support. If the Mountain Yards could be organized and trained beyond self-protection, they could become a source of intelligence on VC activities in that vast area, or perhaps even an offensive force." As time passed and the war ramped up, the concept of the CIDG program shifted. At first, it was a defensive program. Special Forces A teams would train a defense force within these rural hamlets and prevent the Viet Cong access along the border, as well as prevent them from using the villages as guerrilla bases. As time passed, the CIDG program morphed, and A teams, along with their yards, began to conduct offensive operations. More bases sprang up all over South Vietnam, but in particular, they appeared along the western border to prevent Viet Cong from infiltrating from Laos. By the mid-1960s, the rural hamlets turned into frontier fire bases where A teams would engage in heavy combat with the Viet Cong. Many of the heroes and Hall of Famers in Special Forces, whose portraits line the halls of buildings at Fort Bragg, were men who fought valiantly in these hamlets. One lesson Special Forces learned early on during this transition was that although the Yards were fearless and excellent warriors, they had a hard time or difficulty planning and executing operations independently. This fact would continue to haunt Special Forces ODAs as well in Afghanistan during the Village Stability Operation years, or the VSO years, in the 2010s. By 1970, the program ended. The Nixon administration, much like the Obama administration in Afghanistan, wanted to reduce U.S. involvement in Vietnam and quote-unquote Vietnamize the war effort. The plan was to hand over the mission to the Vietnamese government, who almost immediately let the program die. The government of Vietnam still disliked the rural highland tribes and distrusted them even more. Before the war, they actually attempted to disarm them, and even during the war, the government of Vietnam was absolutely maddened when U.S. soldiers handed out weapons and provided them with paramilitary training. Although the government of Vietnam obviously needed their help, they were fearful of conflict with the tribes almost as much as their conflict with the North Vietnamese or the VC. Or the CIDG operation is a critical moment in Special Forces history. It is the defining operation which was crystallized and eternally memorialized in the final stage of the qualification course. Robin Sage is an attempt to sort of Frankenstein replicate the experience of CIDG. When people argue that SF has a long history of UW, they are loosely referring to the program because so many of the features of the CIDG mission are associated with the SF UW mission, living in a rural environment alongside a partner force in a G base, training guerrillas in paramilitary operations, executing civic duties like medcaps, and going on missions or patrols to fight other guerrillas. The miscalculation, though, again, is that CIDG was a counterinsurgency operation, not a UW one. And these may seem like minor differences, but in reality, they are a difference in kind. Tragically, the minute the ODAs left their CIDG partners, their military, economic, and civic works were just torn to pieces. Many of these people that were once our closest allies fled the region or were forced off their tribal lands. The tribes were persecuted and human rights atrocities were routine. What is even more absurd, though, is that the SOF community, your special operations community, should have learned their lesson and they didn't. I'm going to go on a bit of a sort of a side quest here, so just bear with me. In the 2010s, Special Forces teams began to conduct village stability operations, also known or referred to as VSO, within Afghanistan. Despite using words or acronyms and trying to play it off as something altogether different, VSO was almost identical to CIDG. But unlike the CIDG program, VSO was ineffective in the short term and the long term. Moreover, the Vietnam era ODAs were very effective in recruiting local fighters within the hamlets, while Special Forces teams in Afghanistan were largely unable to do the same. Even today, people largely argue that VSO was a sound concept and blame the military and Special Forces regiment for its failure and their inability to follow the program's architecture, coupled with short deployments and a lack of continuity between teams as they deployed in and out of the country, typically on 6-month rotation cycles, and therefore it failed. Military leaders and strategists should have had alarm bells going off from the get-go. VSO was the brainchild of an SF officer named Jim Gant. Although there is a ton of praise for Gant and his VSO concept, he has somehow miraculously avoided scrutiny in and outside of special operations. This is partially due to the fact that the regiment buried his catastrophic departure, and his journalist paramour, Ann Scott Tyson, wrote a book afterwards called American Spartan, trying to fetishize his story and excuse his grotesque behavior, blaming his failures on severe TBI, PTSD, and poor leadership from above. I've had quite a few people in the comments talk about how wonderful this man was and how his VSO concept was brilliant. And again, it only failed because it wasn't executed properly by other Special Forces teams. This, in my opinion, is all wrong. VSO by no means was brilliant, nor a unique concept. He essentially plagiarized the CIDG mission in its totality and used buzzwords to make himself and the plan appear special or different. Gant was just an absolute disaster zone. Whether that was due to TBI or PTSD is frankly irrelevant. The fact of the matter is he totally lost his mind and didn't give a good goddamn about his role in Special Forces or the mission in Afghanistan writ large. So far as I can tell, he suffered from some kind of narcissistic personality disorder and saw himself as a pseudo-Spartan warrior reincarnated, and also believed himself to be a modern version of T.E. Lawrence. He was, in fact, the total opposite of both these identities. Firstly, Spartans were not just sticklers for following their laws, but it literally defined their entire being. Hence the phrase inscribed at Thermopylae, "O stranger, tell the Spartan passerby that here we lie obedient to their laws." Gant not only ignored every rule the army had, but broke a myriad of laws. Joseph Collins, a retired colonel who teaches at the National War College, wrote this about Gant, quote, "He was well into drug and alcohol dependence before he deployed. His condition became worse as his tour progressed, and indeed, he increasingly became the centerpiece of battles against his twin demons, the Taliban and his superior officers. His attitude about war and warfare went off the deep end, and he imagined himself a reincarnated Spartan. He told his often mystified soldiers, quote, 'Who am I? Am I a warrior? My physical, emotional, and spiritual self revolves around being a warrior. I believe war is a gift from God. I'm not a patriot or a mercenary. I fight to fight. I believe if you want to kill, you must be willing to die. I am willing to do both. I pray for a worthy enemy. I believe in the wrathful God of combat. I believe in Hecate. On one occasion, Gant stood in front of a troop formation and ritually cut himself to remember his unit's dead. One soldier described him as, quote, Dances with Wolves meets Charles Bronson. In relation to the Afghan tribe with whom they lived, the author concluded, quote, the message was clear. Jim was fighting not for his country, but for his family, his men, and his tribe. This old soldier found the Vision Quest Spartan babble to be misdirected, dysfunctional, and more than a bit weird. Fighting to fight is not cool or macho. It's feckless. Uncle Sam pays soldiers to fight for their country, not the love of battle. T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, was successful largely due to his deep understanding of Arab culture, his ability to build strong alliances with Arab leaders, and his innovative guerrilla warfare tactics during the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire between the years of 1916 and 1918. By uniting and leading Arab tribal forces, he played a crucial role in disrupting Ottoman supply lines, capturing key cities like Aqaba, contributing significantly to the Allied war effort in the Middle East during World War I. His success was as much political and diplomatic as it was militarily. Gant and his now wife, then adulterous lover, argue he was just like Lawrence because he gained the trust of Afghan tribal leaders and dressed like Afghan Pashtun villagers. Well, whoop-de-doo. So did hundreds, if not thousands, of other SF guys in Afghanistan over the course of 20 years. Lawrence, unlike Gant, had real-world tactical and strategic effects he brought to bear in the war, whereas Gant achieved only minimal tactical and temporary local objectives. Although Gant was a major and therefore should have filled a senior officer position, he preferred to cosplay Lawrence of Arabia in Afghanistan and bring his side chick with him. Both Gant and Tyson were married with kids at the time when they ran off together to Afghanistan. While Gant was popping pills and boozing, saying insane things to his men, Tyson openly lied about what she was doing there and was used as an intelligence officer by Gant, despite the fact that she had no security clearance or training. Again, Collins wrote this, quote, Gant, for his part, encouraged his future wife to come to his area of operations, and from time to time, clandestinely engaged in combat operations. This is both unethical gonzo journalism and a violation of the laws of war. Gant artfully deceived his superiors about the presence of his lover in the combat zone. For her part, Ann Scott Tyson admitted entering Afghanistan on valid visa, but not one for the work she then set out to accomplish. This grand lovers against the world escapade enabled her to write this book. Gant had repeatedly claimed that he never risked the lives of his men, which is a totally fucking insane claim. Of course he did. How could he not? He was seriously mentally impaired, self-medicating with pills and alcohol, and was clearly distracted by having his paramour there with him. This is, okay, I know you want to move on. This is the last thing I'll say about the matter. But the fact that he had Ann Scott write a puff piece book about how amazing he was, and then not only publish it, but they received a ton of public praise is totally insane to me. In 100 years, when people study this incident, every historian will rightfully say that her book, American Spartan, cannot or should not be trusted as a reliable primary source because she was obviously and clearly so biased in his favor and was trying to salvage his reputation and control the narrative. Okay, anyways, the CIDG was far more successful than VSO, but they both suffered from similar problems. Neither program was sustainable without the presence of Special Forces ODAs, and there was no long-term plan or strategy for when the US would inevitably be forced to leave the country, or countries rather. Moreover, rural villages and their host nations' central governments did not get along and were distrustful of one another. Therefore, once American forces left, the central authorities didn't care what happened to these hamlets or villages and were not willing to expend or deploy soldiers or resources to aid them, and therefore they were quickly overrun by the enemy. Moreover, in both operations, Special Forces A-teams struggled with internal threats. In the 2010s, a serious hindrance to VSO was the routine blue-on-green attacks, and therefore soldiers were hesitant to recruit local villagers. This was also true, by the way, in the CIDG program. The VC were able to recruit villagers and use them as intelligence sources, and very often would convince them to destroy the exterior defense perimeter, allowing the VC to swarm in. While the CIDG program was underway, the CIA began tasking Special Forces A teams in a whole host of roles that are almost impossible to fully comprehend and understand in detail. Simpson describes it this way, quote, "Probably no aspect of the Vietnam War is more confusing than the relationship between various Special Forces manned units not in the CIDG program. The CIA used Special Forces detachments in many parts of Vietnam for a variety of purposes. For example, the elite airborne ARVN Ranger battalions were trained by SF detachments, usually on TDY from Okinawa. The South Vietnamese Special Forces were trained by SF detachments as well. The CIA also used some 50 Special Forces soldiers to train and supervise its paramilitary provincial reconnaissance units, or the PRU program. One of the largest users of SF soldiers outside of the CIDG program was the Special Operations Group, or SOG. Although it used SF soldiers, it had no official relationship to the 5th Special Forces Group. Now, of all these projects, SOG was probably the most notable. It ran under the cover name of Study and Observations Group and included individuals from every branch in the US military. Many who are vaguely familiar of SOG immediately think of MACV-SOG, but the SOG program was much broader in scope and oversaw a multiplicity of covert paramilitary operations. As early as the late 1950s, the CIA and their soft counterparts within SOG, including both Special Forces A teams and SEAL platoons, began to devise plans to clandestinely insert South Vietnamese agents into North Vietnam in order to lay the groundwork for their own insurgency. The goal was to undermine and deteriorate the North Vietnamese war effort, not overthrow the government. In May 1961, the president and his national security team approved Memorandum Number 52, which directed the CIA to begin to deploy their agents into North Vietnam and Laos. The memo stated this, quote, "Expand present operations of the 1st Observation Battalion in guerrillas areas of North Vietnam under joint MAG-CIA sponsorship and direction. This should be a full operational collaboration with the Vietnamese, using Vietnamese civilians recruited with the CIA aid. In Laos, infiltrate teams under light civilian cover to southeast Laos to locate and attack Vietnamese communist bases and lines of communication. These teams should be supported by assault units of 100 to 150 Vietnamese for use on targets beyond capabilities of the teams. Training of teams could be a combined operation by CIA and US Army Special Forces. Now, unfortunately, the Vietnamese, well-trained or not, failed to facilitate these operations on both sides, in North Vietnam and across the Laos border, and they were huge failures. SOG deployed their Vietnamese partisans into North Vietnam, but many were quickly captured, questioned, and executed. Resupply and communication with these agents was difficult, if not impossible, and Simpson suggests that all of the 6 teams that were infilled into North Vietnam were likely run by the communists anyways, feeding disinformation back to the United States. No US personnel joined these teams. Now, this is illuminating. This is the first time in Special Forces history where the opportunity arose for the CIA, SOG, and SF to attempt to execute a true UW mission. But even in this era, despite all of its flexibilities, the CIA and the DoD apparently believed it was too dangerous or unnecessary to utilize American personnel. This is the reality of UW missions. The CIA will never insert a Special Forces team, or their own team, presumably, when they can just use natives. Similar attempts were made by SOG to parachute Vietnamese SOF members into Laos to conduct recon missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but these efforts were not very effective either. The Vietnamese were not fond of the mission, and the communists were excellent trackers and would quickly hunt down the teams and destroy them. Eventually, like so many of these counterinsurgency operations led by SF advisors, leadership eventually would relent and allow ODAs or A-team soldiers to join their host nation counterparts. Simpson summarizes it this way. He says, quote, "The SOG Vietnamese also showed a real reluctance to parachute into enemy territory, so it was determined that American military presence would be added to induce the needed backbone and success." John Plaster, in his book SOG, discusses this problem in depth. At first, Defense Secretary McNamara only wanted Vietnamese forces to be inserted into Laos via static line parachutes, despite Special Forces ODAs requesting that they join their partner force. DC still did not want to risk American boys in the cross-border recon missions. Plaster reports this, quote, between then and July 1st, 5 teams, each with 8 Vietnamese, parachuted into Laos. We practically had to force them on the airplane at gunpoint, a disgusted Special Forces Colonel Charlie Norton reported. Leaping Lima's results reached Presidential Advisor William Bundy in a terse report. All of the teams were located by the enemy and only 4 survivors returned. The survivors' stories were shocked, confused, and unreliable, although they reported crossing a network of trails and roads invisible from the air, some carrying truck convoys, and NVA everywhere. ODAs in Afghanistan, once again, faced a very similar problem. Many Afghan Special Forces, or ANASF, were incapable of planning and executing missions on their own and thus required SF leadership and guidance. I personally saw this firsthand, and very often when we tried to motivate our ANASF counterparts to conduct just a simple presence patrol or engage with the locals, they refused. In the end, they came up with one excuse or another as to why they wouldn't or couldn't. In December of 1963, the CIA handed SOG oversight over to the DoD, and the DoD asked the agency for their continued assistance. The program was run by colonels out of Saigon with liaisons from other US and Vietnamese agencies. Finally, in 1965, DC gave Special Forces the green light to begin their operations into Laos to recon, harass, and destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was a grisly operation. Plaster noted, quote, nobody knew with certainty what was in Laos. Learning that would be the object of SOG's new operation, Shining Brass, which would form recon teams of tribal mercenaries led by U.S. Green Berets. To head Shining Brass, Blackburn chose Colonel Arthur D. Bull Simmons. Simmons was the right man for the job. Between 1961 and 1962, he had recruited and trained Laotian Ka tribesmen for the CIA. Now, although the CIDG defines the SF's mission set broad writ, MACV-SOG and their efforts are among the most celebrated and inspiring operations executed by Green Berets to date. These operations are the underpinning for what motivate young men to want to join Special Forces, which seems completely lost on the regiment today. Men want to be challenged. They want to push themselves and prove their worth. It's why the new Ranger Regiment marketing ploy works so well. And if you haven't seen it, go check it out on YouTube. But it literally makes me want to go re-enlist as an 11 Bravo with a Ranger contract. MACV-SOG missions are rightfully among the most revered operations, not only in SF history, but of all U.S. Army history, next to the Normandy invasion and Iwo Jima. The operation was called Shining Brass, and the teams were initially made up of 12 men, 3 Green Beret and 9 Nung mercenaries. The objective of these recon teams was to monitor the Ho Chi Minh Trail, as well as locate enemy bases or infrastructure and call in airstrikes. Often because of MET-TC, which is just Army jargon for mission, enemy, terrain, and weather, troops, and support available, time, and civil considerations, the teams had to take matters into their own hands, and instead of calling in air support, they would very often destroy enemy infrastructure by using any means necessary. By the way, if you're still confused about what MET-TC is or means, it's basically just like an answer to a question, and it's a pseudonym. So for example, it just means it depends on a bunch of variables. So if a SOG commander asked a recon team if they could snatch an enemy POW and they replied with MET-TC, what they're saying is if conditions are favorable, sure, but if not, no. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this history, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a major highway or thoroughfare the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong used in Laos to move weapons, men, food, material equipment, and other resources into South Vietnam. Although Laos was supposed to be a neutral country, it was not. The trail was the pumping heart of their war machine, feeding their insurgent forces the necessary nutrients to fight a seemingly endless guerrilla war against the government of Vietnam and the United States. The goal of MACV-SOG was to put a tourniquet on this artery and disrupt, destroy, and impede their ability in any way possible to stop or at least slow down the supply system. Plaster notes, quote, by the fall of 1965, the Air Force already knew the enemy had spun its 900-mile road systems the length of Laos all the way to South Vietnam's Central Highlands. In one operation, for example, a SOG team located a massive cache of material that could sustain tens of thousands of NVA fighters. An American helicopter gunship fired a few rockets at fleeing NVA and accidentally uncovered a secret enemy cache. Plaster describes the scene this way. He says, quote, "Unknown to the gunship pilot, an enormous cache covered the whole hilltop. One rocket hit an explosive bunker which went nuclear with such force it almost brought the helicopter down. A hastily assembled platoon led by Master Sergeant Bill Country Grimes inserted and swept up the hill. What they found was awesome. Stacked under the trees were tarp-covered 220-pound bags of rice, piled 5 bags wide, 4 high, as far as the eye could see. They counted, calculated, and what a find. It was 500,000 pounds, 250 tons, enough rice to sustain an NVA division at least 6 weeks. When that lucky rocket hit the cache's ordnance bunker, local NVA security guards had run for their lives. One by one, the SOG men dragged down each 220-pound burlap sack, sliced it open, and dumped it out. A time-consuming task. They tried to burn the rice with diesel fuel, called A1s to napalm it, and even urinated on it. We cut damned rice bags from 11 a.m. in the morning until dark, and still had rice bags in front of us," recalled J.D. Bath. "They spilled so much rice, it, quote, looked like it had snowed on the side of that hill. For 2 days, they took turns fighting NVA and dumping rice." Now, the rank structure had mostly disintegrated as the SOG mission progressed. The most experienced men who led the recon teams was the 1-0, the assistant team leader was the 1-1, and the RTO was the 1-2. And each Green Beret was given a call sign that was more akin to a nickname, which effectively evaporated any rank structure between the commandos. Experience and brass balls were more important than individual rank. Their uniform and kit were sterile. They avoided wearing or using standard Army-issued gear and ripped off patches or name tapes of any kind. They were provided with a cover story in the event that they were captured. Some 1-0s actually ordered their point men to dress in black pajamas and carry AK rifles like the Viet Cong, so when they came into contact, they'd have an extra few seconds to gun them down before the VC realized it was an American or one of the American mercenary guys in disguise. They were such sticklers that they didn't even smoke US cigarettes in the field, but instead used Chinese ones. And in every way, shape, and form, this was a clandestine, covert paramilitary operation. One of my favorite parts of special operations is when you're in it, and I mean truly in it, you put your gear to the absolute test. Guys will start manipulating their kit to meet the needs of the mission. So, for example, in SOG, guys would never raise their rifles to their shoulders in a firefight, or at least not initially. They'd snap their selector switch to full auto and shoot from the hip. The reason for this is because it took too much time to raise the stock to their shoulder, and when they were on patrol, very often, they'd abruptly stumble upon enemy VC. It was a lot like the Wild West. The forest was so dense, they couldn't see the enemy until they were literally right on top of each other. The first one to get off a shot would be the one that survived. Similarly, they'd attach their slings to their weapons of choice with cravats so that they didn't make any noise as they moved through or across the terrain. Sometimes they'd use their water pouches or their LBE or load-bearing equipment to carry additional magazines on their person. By the end of 1965, SOG had completed 8 Shining Brass missions. They were all incredible feats of soldiering reminiscent of Robert Rogers' long-range reconnaissance missions against the French during the French and Indian War. The teams would penetrate deep behind enemy lines and identify enemy roads, G-bases, and other structures, weapon caches, food stores, motor pools, etc., etc. Then they'd call in airstrikes to bomb them into the next dimension. The intelligence they recovered was truly incredible and only possible by putting men on the ground. Washington, the CIA, and Special Forces recognized the risk was worth the reward, unlike their future counterparts, tragically. Plaster notes, quote, "The recon men explained, for example, there was no mistaking an enemy high-speed trail for an animal track or simple footpath. The North Vietnamese expertly built their trails as flat as if it were laid out with a mason's level, wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, and when in use, not a twig or leaf was to be found on its hard surface. Where an enemy trail climbed a tree, there were dugout steps and bamboo handrails so well made that they were a marvel of handicraft. Enemy roads were earthen and functional, hidden by meticulous camouflage, which made them all but invisible from the air. The NVA engineers wound the roads around to retain as many trees as possible. Where overhead gaps appeared, they tied bamboo trellises on which they'd place living plants or fresh cut greenery. In some places, the NVA transplanted whole trees. When Robert Rogers first began feeding his intelligence to his commanders, they simply didn't believe him. It was too good to be true. The exact same thing happened with members of SOG. Their intelligence was so specific and illuminating that it sounded like fantasy, and many in Saigon refused to believe them until finally, of course, more intelligence came in from aircraft and other reconnaissance teams, and they could no longer ignore them. As the program progressed and the Intelligence and Special Forces Command realized how successful the teams were, they decided to expand the program. In 1966, the U.S. ambassador in Vietnam, who had been a thorn in the side of SOG, decided to finally take the stick out of his ass. SOG was initially not allowed to use helicopters to insert recon teams, but the AMBO finally gave them the green light, and this, in turn, opened up new operational areas. To meet this new demand, they expanded the teams from 5 to 20, and to help fill the ranks, they started to recruit and train mountain yards, also known as yards. The men of SOG described their relationship with their Nung and yards like they were a sports team. The SF guys were the coaches and the assistant coaches, and the native mercenaries were their players. They were so tight-knit, quite honestly, that some SOG guys or members of SOG would even argue that they were family. Although their partner allies weren't the most independent bunch, they were experts at their craft. Lloyd O'Daniels was the 1-0 for RT California and noted that during firearms training, his mercenaries were expert marksmen. Around this time, SOG teams began to adopt and use the new CAR-15. It was a lighter and more compact version of the M16, although 1-0s still had their men pack a variety of unique weapon systems. MET-TC. Nothing was off the table. One SOG member named Larry Thorne had fought in the Finnish resistance during World War II and was supposedly a former member of the SS. He eventually immigrated to the United States and joined SOG, and during operations, he would use a Carl Gustaf M45 SMG. A far cry from modern special forces, when SOG members were in the rear, they'd visit the shooting range daily. If they were too busy, they'd dry fire the weapons and practice weapons manipulations, reload drills, whatever, etc., etc. Plaster, in an interview, argued that being an expert with their weapon systems was probably the number one thing that kept so many SOG men alive in times of peril. 1966 was a big year for SOG. As the war progressed, both SOG and the enemy evolved. A prime example of this is when SOG started battle damage assessments, or BDAs, in the summer of '66. After bombing the living hell out of an enemy area, teams would go in to evaluate the damage. Despite the hellfire rained down on the VC, when the SOG teams arrived to conduct their BDAs, they were very often met with heavy resistance. Moreover, the VC were so good at building bunkers and tunnels that sometimes, after American sorties devastated the landscape, Viet Cong insurgents would hide underground waiting to ambush the SOG team upon their arrival. That same year, teams were given wiretaps so they could listen to NVA communications. The NVA communicated all along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. At first, they weren't very effective, and the VC could detect when the Americans or the SOG recon teams were listening in on their conversations. But eventually, the CIA was able to produce a higher-end piece of tech so teams could record conversations largely unnoticed. All across the Ho Chi Minh Trail, there were communication lines much like modern telephone lines. Recon teams would climb up and tap the lines and record the conversations on a tape recorder and then bring them back to Saigon for review. One of the most notable wiretap operations was Operation Heavy Green, conducted by SOG's RT Colorado. Under the leadership of the 1-0 Sergeant Ted Braden, the team successfully planted a wiretap near the western end of the demilitarized zone, also known as the DMZ. This mission marked the first successful wiretap by SOG and demonstrated the viability of such operations in enemy territory. However, the mission was in fact costly. During the same operation, RT Arizona was inserted directly on top of an entrenched NVA unit and was completely wiped out. Despite this loss, the wiretap provided invaluable intel. The devices were specially made by the CIA and had rubber coatings to avoid detection from the VC. As noted, SOG continued to expand their operations along the DMZ, and they quickly discovered a network of bike paths where porters could load up to 500 pounds of material, as well as truck traffic where large convoys move supplies and men across the border. Even though the US would bomb the living hell on these roads, the NVA would quickly patch them up and continue operations with astonishing speed. Unlike Laos, the enemy had more firepower that they could bring to bear along the DMZ. Rather than dealing with predominantly a paramilitary or insurgent force like in Laos and Cambodia, whose skills and equipment ranged dramatically from total amateur to professional, the Northern Vietnamese army along the DMZ were a professionalized military force. They even had to deal with Russian MiG fighter jets, which the Northern Vietnamese could bring to bear against the Americans along the DMZ. The efforts of SOG in '66 were so incredible, their intelligence and photography made it back to Washington and was reviewed by Congress. It proved that the Northern Vietnamese government was lying about their operations and their involvement in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In May of 1967, things began to expand even more. Project Daniel Boone was born, and teams were allowed to execute missions in Cambodia now. There was one major hindrance, though. Because Cambodia was a quote-unquote unsympathetic regime, it was imperative that teams recognize that the use of aircraft was denied. The U.S. could excuse away a group of American recon men captured in Cambodia, but they could not explain away a downed American fighter jet. The only authorized American air support were helicopter gunships. Plaster notes, quote, Daniel Boone meant penetrating the territory of an unsympathetic regime. So Washington demanded deniability, absolute deniability. Under no circumstances were SOG teams to be given tactical air support. It was better to lose a whole recon team than have one F-4 Phantom documentable bomb Cambodia. Their mission was recon only, no offensive strikes. By the summer and fall of 1967, SOG had learned that the northeastern area of Cambodia, which shares a border with Vietnam, was just effectively NVA territory. The roads were literally interconnected with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. American forces were effectively fighting a war with both hands tied behind their backs. Without being allowed to officially target the NVA in Laos and Cambodia, the enemy would just continue to supply and resupply their war effort in the South, largely unimpeded, of course, with the exception of SOG's efforts. The VC's dedication to not only the war, but their tactical proficiency is fucking incredible. In the fall of 1967, the 173rd Airborne were fighting for their lives on Hill 875, also known as the Battle of Dak 2. Unbeknownst to the American paratroopers, a recon team had inserted nearby to conduct an operation to see whether or not if the VC were withdrawing or reinforcing Hill 875 from Cambodia. The 1-0 Lowell Round Eye Stevens led his team for 2 days through the jungle without finding anything. And finally, during a break, they discovered a small road that was covered with leaves and brush. Stevens looked up and saw that the VC had literally tied the tops of the tree canopies together with vines so aircraft couldn't see the road from above. The recon team laid in and observed the road, and over the course of a night, they witnessed native laborers or coolies open the road using bamboo sticks to reposition trees, infill with their trucks, retrieve the dead from battle, and then recamouflage the road. As operations expanded, teams would come into contact with enemy forces more often than not, and they were not only outnumbered, but very often overwhelmed, and most times facing company to battalion-sized elements. Tragically, some teams were completely wiped out. Plaster retells one of these heartbreaking stories, stating, quote, The CH-46C Knight carrying Arizona made it safely into the LZ and had just lifted away when the enemy opened fire from 360 degrees, all the way around the LZ. Arizona had landed amid an entrenched NVA unit. Heavy fire pinned down the team and kept the Marine helicopters at bay, with one bird taking 15 hits. Just 15 miles away, RT Colorado radio operator Jim Hendrick heard Esquiviera's voice on the radio screaming, "Come and get us." Despite airstrikes around them, the heavy enemy fire could not be suppressed. Finally, RT Arizona's 1-0, Esquiviera's voice came back on, calm. "That's it, guys," he announced. "It's all over. Don't come in. You haven't got a chance." Esquiviera said they would never get out. "When I quit talking, put that shit right on us," he told Kobe writer Darcy. Minutes later, U.S. fighter bomber dumped their bomb loads across RT Arizona's position. There were no further radio transmissions. Outnumbered almost 100 to 1, the team had been swallowed whole. The first entire SOG team lost to the enemy. In the late 60s, the Air Force needed recon teams to recover downed pilots behind enemy lines, and therefore Operation Bright Light was born. It was quickly expanded to include DA missions deep behind enemy lines to strike POW camps to recover captured American and partner forces. Although they were aggressive and relentless, their efforts were tragically in vain. In 1967, SOG teams liberated 20 Vietnamese Rangers and soldiers, but not a single American. By the time the teams get to the camps, the NVA had then moved prior the POWs, which appears to have been their SOP. The Bright Light missions were among the most dangerous operations next to the BDAs. NVA were typically waiting to ambush the recovery teams and would even dress themselves as American pilots and booby-trap themselves. Plaster concludes, quote, "Declassified records don't clearly disclose how many down aviators saw SOG teammates materialize like guardian angels to rescue them from behind enemy lines. My best estimate is several dozen, and double that if you add air crews who were downed and rescued while supporting SOG operations. There was an equal number of bodies recovered, which, while no occasion for joy, at least gave families positive proof and something to bury, providing at least a degree of mercy." In 1967, Shining Brass was changed to Prairie Fire in an effort to confuse anyone who had heard of SOG's exploits. It was also a term used to indicate that a recon team was in distress and needed an emergency extraction. That same year, the North Vietnamese government began training their own special operations force with the explicit goal of hunting down SOG teams. Known as the 305th Brigade, they were a special counter-recon team. They incentivized these teams by giving them a 10,000 piastres reward, which was 7 months' pay for a single retrieved member of SOG, dead or alive. Plaster notes, quote, "They were true believers. North Vietnam's most politically reliable force, the equivalent of the Nazi Germany elite SS units. More than half of the 305th Brigade's paratroopers became sappers, the suicidal night infiltrators renowned for penetrating American base camps, wearing only shorts and carrying satchel charges. Sappers were respected and feared throughout South Viet Cong. They also used trackers and dogs all across the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and anytime they saw signs of a recon team, they brought in the 305th to hunt them down. By 1967, things were becoming even more treacherous. Now, SOG teams were making contact nearly 50% of the time, and in almost every case, they were vastly outnumbered. The enemy was being reinforced everywhere, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Despite all these odds, SOG was still successful, conducting ambushes, wiretaps, and kill capture missions with less than 100 recon men. Just to reiterate this, the core mission of SOG teams was intelligence gathering, and one of the best ways to accomplish this was to capture enemy prisoners. Evidence of this fact was that SOG teams were given a $100 bonus and free R&R in Taiwan, while the Nungs and Yards were rewarded with a new Seiko watch and cash when they successfully brought back enemy POWs. Their tactics for grabbing the enemy VC varied. Some SOG guys argued a well-placed gunshot was the best way to disable them, while others favored the use of explosives to quote-unquote knock them senseless. Other times, men would simply just grab them. At one point, they used tranquilizer darts, but found that the anesthetic was too slow, and when they tried to bump up the dosage to knock them out even faster, they discovered that the increased dose would very often kill them. In 1966, snatch and grabs were fruitful. SOG teams caught 12 prisoners in layoffs, and in 1967, they were able to grab 10 NVA. However, due to the increase in the 305th counter recon teams, the SOG capacity to capture enemy prisoners was just diminished. To avoid being caught, SOG teams' tactical proficiency increased even further. Plaster notes, quote, "Silence was not a virtue, it was the virtue. If a Yard or American snapped the tiniest twig, his teammates' glaring eyes damned him for endangering the rest. A few such infractions, and the perpetrator was off the team." Camouflage was simple but effective. Just before an operation, each man put on his field gear: rucksack, web gear, hat, scarf, weapon, over unmarked sterile jungle fatigues. Teammates took turns spray painting each other with black streaks to tone down the edges and blend it all together. For their shadowy world of deep jungle, stepping from shadow to shadow, this camouflage pattern fit in superbly. They applied camouflage stick to their faces and touched it up hourly during breaks. Some men took it one step further and dyed their blonde hair black. During a 5-day mission, they spoke only in whispers, but most often they communicated by hand signals, facial expressions, and body language. A nod, a click of the tongue, a raised eyebrow, a shrug, tipping or shaking or nodding the head, an inquiring glance. Most SOG men operated on gut instinct. The men became so adept that they had sort of a sixth sense, much like Spider-Man, that alerted them to the enemy's presence. During one particular mission, a 1-1 named Larry Predmore noticed an owl flying in their direction. Knowing that owls were not fond of taking flight during daytime hours, he leveled his Car-15, monitoring the jungle. A moment later, an NVA tracker appeared, and before the enemy could react, Predmore dropped him. SOG would continue to conduct all of their missions throughout the war, and when the United States began their mass withdrawal, SOG teams still continued their operations. Finally, in 1972, SOG was disbanded, and like the CIDG program, operations were handed off to their Vietnamese partners. Although their host nation allies were valiant fighters, without U.S. military and logistical support, leadership, and guidance, the Vietnamese teams struggled and had limited success. SOG's efforts were unparalleled in U.S. military history, even though to this day they go largely unnoticed. Plaster summarizes it this way, quote, "The Vietnam War's most highly decorated unit with 5 medals of honor was SOG's understrength 60-man recon company at Con Tum. Surely no unit that size had been so decorated since the Civil War. And in that final perilous year when SOG fought alone, Da Nang Base CCN, with only about 70 combat operatives, earned 2 medals of honor and 3 distinguished service crosses. Among SOG's recon units, Purple Hearts were earned at a pace unparalleled in American wars of this century, with casualties at times exceeding 100%. In every way, shape, and form, the MACV-SOG operations pushed special operations fighters to the absolute limit and showed the U.S. Army and the folks in Washington what was truly possible when they recruited and trained elite commandos and tasked them with a daring, if not impossible, mission. The wide array and scope of what SOG members were tasked to do highlights the simple fact that the United States military doesn't need dozens of special operations units, but rather just 1 or 2 that are well-trained and adept for asymmetrical warfare. CIDG, SOG, MACV-SOG, and the other counterinsurgency operations throughout the globe during this epoch were nearly all covert action CIA programs, or at a minimum, started as such before being handed off to the DoD. After Vietnam, Special Forces would never be the same. In the preceding years, Special Operations Command and JSOC were born. Plus, the sort of OG or original gangsters in OSS from World War II had all retired, and therefore the critical link between former OSS guys at the CIA and Special Forces had expired. For all these reasons and more, SF would very rarely, if ever, be allowed to operate as they once had, as a commando paramilitary action arm of the CIA. One of SOG's greatest legacies would ironically cause the inevitable crippling of the Special Forces Regiment. A small handful of former SOG operatives stood up Delta Force to better prepare the DoD and stakeholders in Washington for a hostage rescue crisis situation. Many suggest this was due to the rise of Islamic terrorism in the 1970s and their strategy of taking Western hostages as political leverage. But it is undoubtedly true that one of the key motivating factors was the experience and expertise of SOG operations in Vietnam. After Vietnam, there was some kind of fracture between the two groups within Special Forces. They began to ask themselves, do we pursue or crystallize our regiment to be able to conduct SOG-type missions like Shining Brass, Prairie Fire, and Bright Light? Or do we scratch all of that and dedicate ourselves to the programs like CIDG? Special Forces ditched the former in favor of the latter, and instead of appointing officers with backgrounds in SOG or commando operations, they chose company administrative men to lead the regiment. Simpson is a great representative of the group of SF men who favored the CIDG mission over the SOG mission. Evidence of this fact is he dedicates nearly 1/3 of his book to the CIDG mission and only briefly covers SOG. Simpson and others are part of a group that I like to refer to or call the Praetorian Guard with amnesia within Special Forces. Despite the reality that SF by 1982 had executed 0 UW missions and nearly all its operational experience, expertise, and success were in counterinsurgency operations and special missions, Simpson and legacy members of the regiment desperately wanted to reorient the unit towards UW and civic duty missions. Simpson and others argue that UW was the original mission in the post-World War II era, and that by training for UW, they were kind of training for COIN. Simpson concludes this, quote, "The commanding general of the center is pushing the unconventional warfare mission, and rightly so. Training and expertise in UW is the flesh and blood of Special Forces. Knowing how to operate as guerrillas is the basis for successful counterinsurgency operations. However, if their few well-trained aid detachments and UW training opportunities are scarce, it may be somewhat optimistic to stress UW. The UW mission, above all, requires expertise, training, maturity, and together with the understanding of the importance of having people on your side." Now, to me, this is nonsensical. By 1982, the regiment had existed for 30 years and nearly exclusively conducted COIN operations in one form or another. So why continue to push the UW mission? Why not pivot ever so slightly and prioritize COIN and special missions training and operations? A prudent question is, who was the commanding general Simpson referred to? Well, his name was Major General Joseph Lutz. He is celebrated in special operations for bringing all of the SOF or Special Operations Forces units under one command umbrella and giving Special Forces guys the 18 series MOS to facilitate more career growth in line with their conventional counterparts. While he improved some things within the unit, he also began to wittingly reorient the unit towards becoming a more conventional force. Lutz began his career in the mid-1950s as a young lieutenant in the 12th Cavalry Division, and in 1964 volunteered for Special Forces. He was assigned to 7th Special Forces Group and then deployed to Vietnam for a year, advising and training the Mike Force, which acted as a QRF or Quick Reaction Force element for the CIDG Hamlets. A 1982 New York Times article briefly describes his career this way, quote, "General Lutz was trained in armor as a young officer, but volunteered for Special Forces training and served with 7th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg. In that tour, he helped to test techniques for parachuting from jet transports and took part in the first mass jump from a C-141 Starlifter in August of 1965. From there, he went to Vietnam, where he fought as a Green Beret for a year. Later, he returned to tank duty as a squadron or battalion commander in the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, and in 1977, he won a coveted assignment as the colonel in command of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment at Fort Bliss, Texas. The article goes on to note that he got a master's degree in human relations and did 2 tours at the Pentagon as an educational officer, and then was the director of human resources. Lutz is potentially one of the worst things to have ever happened to Special Forces. He was a company man. He had just enough experience in Special Forces to justify plugging him in at the helm. In truth, he wasn't a soft operator, not even close. He was a company man, administrator, and bureaucrat sent to do the bidding of the conventional army and neuter Special Forces. The first half of his career was in armor, And then after a brief stint in SF, he jumped back into the bureaucracy and buried himself behind a desk in administrative functions and human resources. One of his fellow officers describes him this way, quote, "He's not like most of these snake eaters who do one thing well, special forces, then get into trouble and retire," the officer said. Joe Lutz has a depth in 3 areas: special operations, armored cavalry, and personnel management. The historical record indicates that the Special Forces Regiment was culturally running away from its Vietnam-era identity like their hair was on fire. In a history book written by U.S. Special Operations Command in 1982, the author states, quote, "This struggle," referring to the FID mission in El Salvador, "was so crucial to the rebirth of the spirit of Special Forces and the exercising of the demons," quote unquote, "of Vietnam." Despite their incredible work in Vietnam, Special Forces had created a milieu that seemed to have left some kind of negative stain on the unit, and the leadership sought to rid themselves of it. Major General Lutz may have been Special Forces qualified, but by and large, he was a conventional staff officer who preferred administrative roles and clearly sought to divorce the regiment from its aggressive commando legacy that had led to so many of its celebrated successes, particularly SOG. There are so many arguments as to why SF should just abandon the UW mission. It's difficult to even know where to begin. Firstly, and most obviously, after 72 years, not a single Green Beret has ever executed a UW mission, which I have to say is a terrible batting average. It's like if you went to med school and graduated as an anesthesiologist, but never once practiced medicine and instead decided to become an electrician, but continue to tell people after 70 years, you were an anesthesiologist. Now, it is often argued that the invasion of Afghanistan by 5th Group was a UW operation because they worked with the Northern Alliance to expel the Taliban, but it wasn't. This was an overt invasion by American Special Operations Forces who hired a ragtag mercenary force to lay down the groundwork for a full-scale invasion. The Northern Alliance wasn't a political movement, but rather a confederacy of tribal warlords and guerrillas who didn't want to be governed by an extremist Islamist organization. It is indeed an asymmetrical campaign, but it wasn't remotely close to a UW operation. UW operations are covert. There was no mystery as to who was bombing the living hell out of the Taliban a few weeks after 9/11. Also, there was no attempt to execute a political revolution through an insurgency force. Within a few years, the Northern Alliance was disbanded, and Hamid Karzai was installed as the new president of Afghanistan. It was simply the first step in a conventional military invasion. Secondly, there have been many opportunities for the U.S. to deploy Green Berets on UW operations, and the DoD and those in Washington have decided against it. The invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets is a prime example of this. Instead of deploying an ODA to assist the Mujahideen, the CIA ran UW operations by financing, arming, and training rural Afghan fighters against the Soviets, and with great success. The fact that the CIA and DoD were unwilling to commit ODAs to UW operations in both Vietnam and Afghanistan indicate there is a huge reluctance to deploy Special Forces teams behind enemy lines. And frankly, it makes perfect sense. It is too politically hazardous, and the CIA can just as easily recruit, train, and redeploy natives from target countries to execute UW operations. The CIA also has the legal authority and capacity to conduct covert action operations, while the DoD and Special Forces, Green Berets, don't. Given all of this evidence, it has become painfully obvious that SF will never be deployed in a UW role, short of a World War III scenario where American DoD forces and CIA resources are stretched to their absolute limit. By the way, I should note that I'm not arguing that they should have. I'm simply making the case they could have, and it would have made sense on some strategic level. Historically, the first generation of SF and CIA officers had grown up together in the OSS during World War II, and thus Special Forces had a direct link to friends in high places who trusted them to execute sensitive special missions. Once this generation was gone, strong ties between the two organizations began to drift. New laws and regulations passed by Congress during the 1970s also made it even more difficult for Special Forces to acquire sensitive clandestine missions, particularly after the war in Vietnam, there was a public outcry for the United States to stop entangling itself in wars or conflicts that were so far removed from the domestic lives of the average American. Finally, covert action operations is the responsibility of the CIA, and the CIA has a robust paramilitary arm, which they'll happily employ way before calling an ODA. Moreover, they recognize how politically fraught and hazardous it is to use Americans in a UW situation. Now, you're probably asking yourself the million-dollar question, why does this matter? Well, according to a multiplicity of current and retired Green Berets, Special Forces has been in a state of crisis really since the early 80s. Colonel Crute theorized in 2020 that the identity crisis was due to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the historical record indicates that this has been festering for much longer. In the early 80s, Special Forces soldiers were arguing over whether they were supposed to conduct SOG-type operations or CIDG military advisory and or facilitate military-style civic duties. Before and during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, SF leadership desperately wanted to reclaim their UW and or military advisory role for reasons that are only speculative. While SF leadership were disputing these matters, JSOC and the CIA have took the reins of what were historically Special Forces missions. Today, Delta works with partner forces to execute special missions and counterinsurgency operations all over the world, particularly in places like Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, working by, with, and through host nation partners, all of which 40 years ago was the responsibility of Special Forces Green Berets. CIDG, SOG, MACV-SOG, Project Delta, Shining Brass, Prairie Fire, Hatchet Forces, Bright Light, the Congo Hostage Rescue, Bolivia, counterinsurgency operations in El Salvador and Colombia, and even in Mogadishu in the late 80s and early 90s, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on and on. Between 1952 and 1980, Special Forces was effectively operating as the CIA paramilitary arm, facilitating kinetic covert action programs all over the world, both with and without partner forces. After Vietnam, the SF men in favor of a more CIDG pseudo-UW mission set argued that SF was never intended to execute direct action missions like they had been doing in the mid-20th century, and in particular in Vietnam vis-a-vis SOG. The heartburn over whether or not SF should be conducting DA missions has been a point of contention since the early 80s and to this day haunts the regiment. Simpson in 1983 argued, quote, "Young men who successfully complete airborne training and rugged Ranger-heavy SF course tend to be highly self-confident, cocky, and a bit arrogant. Being macho is the opposite of having concern for the people and realizing the need for their support. Direct action missions require supremely confident, highly trained, well-led units to pull them off. Although the UW mission has top priority, the training itself better equips the young soldiers for DA missions." The truth is that the Vietnam era defined the unit, and regardless of whether or not the old guard wants to admit it, SOG and all of their achievements, direct action and other kinetic missions, are as much a part of Special Forces' legacy as the CIDG program. Moreover, Special Forces' role in Vietnam was an incredible blend of coin operations coupled with DA missions. SF during this era was an orchestra of training hundreds of thousands of indig, long-range reconnaissance missions, harassing and undermining the VC efforts along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, DA kinetic operations against hard targets, special missions like raiding POW camps or training partisans to lead an insurgency in North Vietnam. Bottom line, SF was full of pipe-hitting commandos, and the men that now fill the ranks shouldn't shy away from that identity because of men like Simpson, Lutz, and others who argue it might threaten their capacity for Special Forces civic or military advisory programs in the future, which, as I've shown, were merely one minor component were minor components of Green Berets' larger historic or legacy role. If anything, Special Forces showed the DoD and agency partners that they were a Tier 1 unit before, during, and after Vietnam. Every problem or challenge that was thrown at them, Special Forces teams pummeled their enemies into the ground. What started as a classic SF military advisory counterinsurgency mission in the CIDG program evolved into a fully integrated direct action and asymmetrical warfare campaign showcasing the Green Berets' adaptability and strategic depth. It still bewilders me to this day why leaders in the regiment turn their backs on this historic reality. Simpson's predictions about SF and what their role was going to be in the future, it was not only wrong, but he makes a categorical error. He suggests that there were likely going to be incursions from the Soviets in West Germany, and if American pilots were shot down, it was incumbent on Special Forces teams to recover them, much like the bright light operations. He also assessed that the Soviet threat in Germany would not only endure but worsen, and ODAs could be in stay-behind missions to disrupt the Soviet advances. He also believed there was a serious threat still in Korea. He argued that the North Koreans would inevitably invade South Korea, and ODAs would need to be in stay-behind missions once again to conduct UW operations with South Korean allies. Not only was he wrong across the board, but by demanding that SF reorient towards UW, the regiment allowed an opening for other special operations units to take over their legacy roles and duties. Obviously, it's easy for me to be critical 30 years later when I have historical hindsight. However, not a single one of Simpson's predictions came to fruition, and in fact, Special Forces continued to pursue coin-fit operations all over the globe throughout the 80s, and then dominated many of the coin operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. They simply appeared different because they were operating in an urban environment in Iraq and the rugged mountains in Afghanistan instead of the jungles of Laos or Vietnam. And yes, of course, in Vietnam, they had a much broader left and right limit, so to speak. But that doesn't negate the fact that both were counterinsurgency operations. It boggles the mind that so many individuals have passed through Special Forces and just refuse to see the writing on the wall. Instead of acknowledging these realities and 30-odd years of Special Forces experience in counterinsurgency and clandestine operations around the globe, they still demand that UW is their primary reason for being. But what they failed to realize is that in future conflicts, U.S. Special Operations Forces across all branches would be forced to work with partner forces as seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, and therefore Green Berets' uniqueness and capabilities would become foggy juxtaposed to every other conventional and special operations unit who were executing by, with, and through missions within the GWAT era. When the war in Afghanistan broke off, Delta operators as well as Special Forces ODAs worked side by side with the Northern Alliance. Delta immediately pivoted to the by, with, and through sort of framework, and they ended up working with local nationals not also dissimilar from Special Forces Green Berets. Major Thomas Greer lays this out in perfect detail in his book, Kill Bin Laden. After 9/11, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld visited the Delta compound to watch a demonstration of Delta's capabilities. He says, quote, Rumsfeld had a slight look of angst, and he said to me, what we really need is a small group of folks, say 2 to 4 people, that can go anywhere in the world and execute discrete missions against these people, meaning Al-Qaeda. I was shocked. Did the SecDef, a month and a half after 9/11, still have no idea what Delta had to offer our nation? Was Delta's operational security so tight that not even the secretary understood the unit's capabilities? I didn't have to worry answering because various generals and senior special operations officers nervously showered him with answers, buzzwords, and reassurances that the capability he had just described was exactly Delta's job. Those unique abilities he described had already existed for many years. Throughout the exercise, we emphasized that we were capable of operating alongside Afghan warlords, infiltrating hostile areas, conducting long-range helicopter assaults in extremely cold weather, and fighting in dangerously unforgiving mountain passes. Now, if you were or are in Special Forces and this statement doesn't infuriate you, I don't know what to tell you. You can feed me this bullshit line about how Special Forces' role is advisory, implying that SF is a pseudo hands-off force, which it is not. But that would simply highlight your complete ignorance of Special Forces' entire history beginning in the 1950s. What Major Greer just described is indeed Special Forces' core mission, working with Afghan warlords, infiltrating hostile territory. Last I checked, it was the Green Berets in Vietnam, South America, Africa, Asia, and beyond, who for decades worked with a whole host of partners and allies running covert or sensitive counterinsurgency operations. Now, if you think that's the worst of it, trust me, it just keeps getting better. After 9/11, the DoD deployed two ODAs, 555 and 595, to go to Afghanistan and meet up with the Northern Alliance. Just to clarify one more time, the Northern Alliance was not an organized political revolutionary resistance movement like the French or Czech resistance organizations in World War II. As previously stated, they were a confederacy of Afghan tribes run by warlords that sought to defend northern Afghanistan from the evil predations of the Taliban. Moreover, the CIA had been working with these groups since the mid to early 1990s. And when Fifth Group arrived, they quickly linked up with this ragtag mercenary force and leveraged them, the Northern Alliance, and US bombers to destroy Taliban targets and to lay the groundwork for a full-scale American invasion. All of this was overt. None of it was covert. These teams were wildly effective, and they took Kabul with relative ease. Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters quickly fled to Kandahar, while others entrenched themselves in a mountainous area known as Tora Bora. Now, at this point, Delta Force and the CIA joined up with them. And almost immediately, Major Thomas Greer, who was the Delta Force commander, began to recruit and arm a Northern Alliance warlord, paying him $250,000 in cold, hard American cash. Then there was the question of who would venture or who would go into the hazardous Tora Bora Mountains to hunt down bin Laden and other AQI or al-Qaeda fighters. Major Greer consulted with the SF commander, who was Colonel Mulholland, about what they should do, what their next steps would be. And unlike the SF risk takers of the Vietnam era, Mulholland was far more risk adverse and did not want to lead the charge or allow his men to get too close to the enemy. Greer describes the situation this way. He says, quote, "There was a serious internal struggle going on between the Americans. The Green Beret commander, Task Force Dagger's Colonel Mulholland, who had been initially reluctant to commit any of his Green Berets to assist General Ali, apparently was still unconvinced. He had been burned before by unreliable warlords. A few weeks earlier, Colonel Mulholland reviewed the CIA plan to go after bin Laden in the mountains and declared it was flawed and wanting on several accounts. With no ability to evacuate casualties by air, winter growing worse by the day, no American QRF or quick reaction force, and the prospect of a treacherous uphill slugfest, and working with the warlord who had not been vetted, the task force Dagger commander opted to pass until the CIA could present better intelligence. And who could blame a prudent commander for deciding not to risk his men against a well-prepared defense while supported only by an indigenous force of unknown reliability and quality? Mulholland was also fully aware that the Soviets had failed to take Tora Bora. If the estimated enemy strength in the mountains today was valid, he could foresee a meat grinder fight awaiting American forces. Given his initial resistance, with no other American troops available, Bernson and Suter adjusted their plans. The only choice remaining was to look internal, to pool their resources and retask the mission to their own people. Both believed strongly that bin Laden was in Tora Bora, and that to not act quickly would border on negligence, would be irresponsible and practically criminal. The experienced field commanders felt that not grasping the opportunity smacked too much of the slow-moving pre-9/11 culture that both the intelligence and special operations community had sucked down year after year. They agreed with Mulholland that the risk was extremely high. They just were not going to take no for an answer. After considering their options, which were not many, Bernson and Suter picked 4 of their best operators and sent them out to locate and kill as many al-Qaeda forces as they could. And if they could develop the picture a little more, maybe prove for sure that AQI had in fact taken up refuge in Tora Bora, then perhaps Mulholland or Central Command might be more willing to commit some muscle. Somehow, in the span of 30-odd years, Special Forces went from deploying SOG operators, penetrating deep into Indian country with little resources available to them, to Afghanistan, where they shied away from the fight in Tora Bora because it could be too hazardous. Meanwhile, Delta was more than willing to take the fight to the enemy in the mountains with the same amount of assets available to them, or lack thereof. Eventually, Mulholland allowed his ODAs to set up a static OP far enough away from the enemy so they were safe, but close enough so they could still call in airstrikes. He also required them to stay in their uniforms and not change into local Afghan garb like the Delta operators had, in order to avoid a friendly fire incident. Iraq and Afghanistan forced the Army and SOCOM to greenlight Green Berets to do what they had been doing for decades, quite frankly: counterinsurgency operations with partner forces. Both theaters of war were counterinsurgency intensive. In the early days of Iraq, because the enemy was entrenched in urban areas, ODAs executed a multiplicity of direct action missions, some with JSOC and some without. Although Delta and Rangers were meant to handle these types of sensitive kinetic operations on paper, JSOC units were stretched too thin, and there were just too many operations that needed attention, and therefore SF was tapped and met the challenge and did their jobs. And frankly, they did them well, which should not surprise anyone. Around 2010, the Praetorian Guard with a severe case of amnesia had resurfaced once again and demanded that SF ODAs reorient towards their legacy mission. What they were saying sounds super reminiscent of what Simpson and his coterie were saying in the post-Vietnam era. No direct action, no offensive kinetic operations. We stick to advising the partners and winning hearts and minds. And when we get back to the US, we're gonna refocus our efforts on UW. Rather than conduct offensive strikes and maintain our security presence, the Obama administration demanded that US forces withdraw and hand operations over to the Afghans and Iraqis. This should sound familiar. Again, it's not at all dissimilar from what the Nixon administration did during its disastrous withdrawal from Vietnam, and the results yielded the exact same catastrophic results. As US forces withdrew, Taliban and ISIS fighters flooded back in. I personally witnessed this myself on the ground in 2013. We had secured our small area of operation in Kandahar with daily presence patrols, while infantry units manned 2 security outposts positioned in strategic locations within the operational space. And in March of 2013, we got the call from some general in Washington demanding we tear down those outposts as part of the Obama withdrawal effort. We tried to explain that if we did what he told us, we'd immediately lose security, which would result in a catastrophic loss of both security and rapport with the locals, and they just ignored us. Literally within 24 hours after the outposts were bulldozed, the Taliban were back and entrenched inside villages where we had once strolled through with relative safety in the previous 6 months. When we attempted to go on operations, we immediately met not only resistance, but IEDs were legitimately everywhere, and we were not authorized to use airstrikes, so we frankly basically just abandoned the mission at that point and waited to go home a month later. It is clear from Major Greer's writings and other testimonies from other JSOC operators that the unit saw Iraq and Afghanistan as their moment to shine. Although they had served in minor conflicts previously, Afghanistan and Iraq were the perfect opportunity for them to roll out and show Washington and the CIA what they were capable of, and they didn't disappoint. Over the course of 20 years, they expanded their role from being a lightning strike direct action counter-terror unit to a robust counterinsurgency unit that was specially trained to handle difficult and sensitive geopolitical operations with or without host nation partners. Special Forces, on the other hand, was reluctant. While the men on the front lines wanted to take the fight to the enemy, leaders in Special Forces Regiment were very often hesitant, like Mulholland, asking themselves whether they were really supposed to be doing aggressive counterinsurgency operations, even though their predecessors had been doing clandestine and covert counterinsurgency operations for the past 70 years. Today, Delta and their partners in JSOC handle operations and missions that historically would have been given to Green Berets. They work closely with partner forces, training, advising, and executing counterinsurgency operations all over the world. They recover personnel and hostages like SF had done in the Congo and in Vietnam, like the Sante raid, and are closely partnered with the CIA. Green Berets are leaving the unit in droves, largely because they are not given a clear picture of what their intended role is within special operations. While the Praetorian Guard argues that Green Berets are meant to do UW and FID, aka JSETs, Green Berets look to their left and they see no UW mission on the horizon, as well as other conventional units handling similar FID JSET missions, while Delta is tasked with legacy SF sensitive and covert FID counterinsurgency missions. The whole idea behind being a special unit is that you're unique, and the plurality of the other members of the armed services cannot execute the same missions as you, either because they don't have the capability, training, or willpower. If Special Forces doesn't figure out their role and frankly fight for it and prove to the DoD and Washington that they are still capable operationally of handling sensitive operations like they had in the first 30 years of their existence, they'll be doomed to fade into the conventional Army abyss. Holy Mother of Moses. That was a long one. Thanks for joining me, guys. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. Deuces.